1917. The water was black, the fog thick as smoke, and Coxswain Daniel David Loomis couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Aboard USS Fanning, the Atlantic felt hostile. The U.S. had only just entered the war, and these waters belonged to the Kaiser and his invisible hunters. Then he saw a ripple, barely there. At first, he thought it was a hair on the lens, but there it was again, a faint, narrow crease on the surface, rising from the waves. He shouted, "Periscope." It was every sailor's nightmare. When a U-boat periscope appeared, a torpedo surely came next. The alarm sounded. Boots thundered across the deck. Depth charges were armed. For the first time in the war, a U.S. ship had spotted the hunter before it struck. In the final months of 1916, Germany stood at a crossroads. Stalemated on the Western Front, Berlin had a tough pill to swallow. Conventional warfare would not win them this war. Their secret weapon, U-boats, had already devastated Allied shipping. But despite these successes, Britain's vital supply routes remained open. Without decisive escalation, Germany's window for victory was closing. Grand Admiral Henning von Holtzendorf, chief of the Imperial Admiralty Staff, made his move on December 22, 1916, presenting a confidential memo to Kaiser Wilhelm II and Field Marshal Hindenburg. He argued the time had come to abandon the prize rules and unleash unrestricted submarine warfare. No warnings, no lifeboat provisions. Sink every enemy vessel heading for Britain. His plan hinged on numbers. Sinking 600,000 tons of merchant shipping per month, sustained for 4 to 5 months, would cut British imports by roughly 40% and starve the country into surrender. Holtzendorf acknowledged that America's entry could not be avoided, yet he remained unwavering. He bluntly assured the Kaiser, quote, "Not one American will land on the continent." He figured a fast, lethal blow would end the war before U.S. troops could tip the scales. Pressure in Berlin mounted. Chancellor Bettmann Halleck warned that such a policy risked American involvement in economic retaliation, but Holtzendorf and Hindenburg countered decisively. At the Pless Conference on January 9, 1917, military leaders prevailed, and the Kaiser approved unrestricted warfare, effective February 1, 1917. At the end of January, Berlin formally informed Washington of the policy shift. By February 3rd, President Wilson severed diplomatic ties. By April 6th, the U.S. declared war. In Berlin, the mood was triumphant. Holtzendorf had set the stage for a submarine blockade of unprecedented scale. The U-boats lurked beneath the North Atlantic, engines humming, torpedoes primed. Within weeks, German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than ever. In February 1917 alone, they dropped over 500,000 GRT. In April, the total reached a staggering 860,000 registered tons. Britain's food silos began to run low. Panic swept through London's warehouses and docks. There was a genuine chance that the island could collapse before American reinforcements arrived. The Allies didn't know how to react. Convoys had been rejected early on as wasteful and slow. The British Admiralty refused to entrust supplies to group protection. But as tonnage sank and shipping losses hit 300,000 plus GRT monthly, the urgency mounted. Behind closed doors, naval staff fought for immediate change. Germany, meanwhile, moved fast. By February 1st, over 100 U-boats patrolled key shipping lanes, their commanders on high alert. Holtzendorf's confidence remained firm, even as intelligence reports confirmed America had begun preparing troop convoys and expanding its Atlantic fleet. If Germany's U-boat offensive sealed Britain's fate by summer 1917, Berlin would claim victory. If not, Germany would ignite a new front, one powered by fresh American manpower and material. But the Allies were not passive. Offshore, preparations were underway. Convoy tactics, depth charge experiments, and repositioned destroyers would soon test Holtzendorf's gamble. The next chapter, beginning in spring 1917, would decide whether unrestricted submarine warfare would break Britain or backfire catastrophically. The aggressive new U-boat strategy seemed to be working just as planned. Soon, Britain's grain reserve shrank to just 6 weeks' supply. A little more, and Britain would starve. Berlin pressed on, confident that their blockade would collapse Britain by summer. Despite facing society's collapse, the British still resisted change. The British Admiralty, convinced convoys would slow deliveries and create bigger targets, stubbornly clung to the every ship for itself policy. The tide began turning in late April 1917. Rear Admiral Alexander Duff of the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Division urged First Sea Lord John Jellicoe to reconsider. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George also pressed, recalling that Germany's economy teetered on the edge. At a March staff meeting, Naval Staff dismissed convoys, but by April 27th, the Admiralty relented and approved full North Atlantic convoy coverage. Meanwhile, American naval leadership mobilized swiftly. Vice Admiral William S. Sims, newly appointed liaison to London, warned the British that U-boats would win without escort support. By May 1st, Sims had secured Admiral Jellicoe's agreement. Within days, 12 U.S. destroyers were ordered to Europe, and by May 10th, the first escorted convoy departed Gibraltar, arriving unscathed on May 22nd. The full transatlantic system kicked off on June 15th, with a convoy leaving Hampton Roads under HMS Roxburgh and joined mid-ocean by 8 destroyers. Losses dropped immediately. Although a straggler was lost on that maiden voyage, the success silenced naval skeptics. Convoys expanded quickly. By July, over 30 U.S. destroyers were overseas. By May and June, a coordinated Allied defense took shape. British destroyers, armed merchant cruisers, pre-dreadnoughts, and U.S. destroyers formed layered screens. Airships and balloons began providing aerial surveillance. Though only 43 destroyers were ready, far fewer than the 75 needed, their tactical benefit was immediate. By summer 1917, the strategy quietly reshaped the war at sea. Even with many stragglers, each convoy's concentrated escort absorbed U-boat threat. Sinking rates dropped significantly, and by July, tonnage lost per month never again reached April's levels. This turnaround set the stage for American destroyers like USS Fanning and USS Nicholson to transition from escort duty to offensive submarine hunters. The Periscope barely disturbed the surface of the North Atlantic, a steel finger probing the grey waters 7 miles south of Queenstown, Ireland. Through its narrow lens, Captain Lieutenant Gustav Amberger watched convoy OQ-20 emerge from the afternoon mist on November 17, 1917. For 2 days, he had positioned U-58 along this precise route, engines silent, crew moving in whispers. The submarine hung suspended between surface and deep, a 191-foot predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Amberger swept the Periscope across the convoy formation. 8 merchant vessels struggling to maintain 4 columns abreast, shepherded by 6 American destroyers and 2 British corvettes. His target was already selected, the 5,782-ton steamship Welshman, riding low in the water with her cargo of vital supplies. In U-58's cramped control room, the crew prepared their torpedo with practiced efficiency. 8 days into Amberger's first patrol as commander, he'd already sent 1 British sailing vessel to the bottom. The Welshman would make it 2. U-58 had claimed 21 vessels in 1 year of operation under her previous commander. She was a U-57 type submarine, commissioned August 9, 1916, and launched that October as part of the Imperial German Navy's 2nd Flotilla. Her crew of 39 men had perfected the art of the ambush, and Amberger intended to maintain that tradition. 400 yards away, USS Fanning rolled through the swells, her narrow hull protesting each wave. The 742-ton Paulding-class destroyer had been launched in 1911 for a different kind of warfare, but hasty retrofitting at Boston had equipped her with Mark II depth charges, 300-pound drums of TNT that sailors called ash cans for their ungainly appearance. Under acting commander Lieutenant Arthur Chips Carpenter, Fanning guarded the convoy's rear port flank, her skeleton crew maintaining a vigilant watch despite exhaustion from months of convoy duty. Fanning was a ship that showed her age. Her depth charges had an alarming tendency to detonate prematurely. The previous month, 2 early explosions had damaged her own generators and rattled the crew. She rolled badly in heavy seas, yet her crew had developed a fierce pride in their old destroyer, painting over rust spots and maintaining her guns with religious devotion. Leading the escort was USS Nicholson, Commander Frank D. Berrien's 1,050-ton O'Brien-class destroyer, commissioned in April 1915. Where Fanning was narrow and temperamental, Nicholson was broader, more stable, armed with 4 4-inch guns and torpedo tubes that marked her as a ship built for modern warfare. Berrien, the senior officer present, had already proven himself by driving off U-62 in October, though without a confirmed sinking. The convoy had departed Queenstown Harbor at 11:45 a.m., spending hours forming into columns while the escorts circled, like sheepdogs organizing their flock. At 4:10 p.m., with 7 miles between them and safety, they steamed through patchy fog and fading afternoon light. On Fanning's bridge, Coxswain David Daniel Loomis rubbed his eyes and resumed scanning the horizon. His shipmate spoke of his vision with something approaching awe. One officer called them, quote, a most extraordinary set of eyes. Where others saw only gray water meeting gray sky, Loomis could pick out details invisible to normal sight. The fog had thickened, visibility dropping to barely 400 yards. Spray from the bow mixed with mist, creating a shifting wall that seemed to swallow the forward escorts. Loomis swept his gaze methodically across the water, a pattern repeated thousands of times over months of convoy duty. There it was. Something wrong. It was not a wake. A thin, dark line, perhaps 1.5 inches in diameter, protruded maybe 10 inches above the surface, motionless. He shouted, "Periscope." Loomis's shout cracked across the bridge like a whip. Lieutenant Walter O. Henry, officer of the deck, reacted instantly, quote, "Left full rudder. All ahead, full." His hand slammed the general quarters alarm as Fanning's bow began swinging hard to port. Throughout the ship, bells clanged and men scrambled from their stations, racing to battle positions. In U-58's control room, Amberger watched through his periscope as a destroyer materialized from the mist, bow on, closing fast. The submarine had been moving so slowly to avoid detection that it produced no wake, but their stealth had become a trap. The American was too close, coming too fast. But their sub was equipped with the slender finger periscope. There was no way the destroyer had spotted them, not in this fog. Carpenter had reached the bridge, taking in the situation at a glance. Fanning was bearing down on the periscope's last position, but a direct ramming would damage his ship. He commanded the ship to turn to release its depth charges. The explosive rolled off Fanning's fantail, a gray drum tumbling into darker gray water. The crew held their breath, counting seconds. The Mark II charges were notoriously unreliable. Their hydrostatic fuses were primitive at best. The explosion came too soon, barely 30 feet down instead of the intended 50. The premature detonation hammered Fanning's stern, knocking men from their feet and disabling the destroyer's generators. Emergency lighting flickered on as damage control teams scrambled to assess the harm. But premature or not, the blast wave found its target. U-58 shuddered as if struck by a giant hammer. In the submarine's engine room, electrical panels sparked. The stern diving planes jammed, and high-pressure oil lines ruptured, spraying their contents across hot machinery. Water began seeping through strained seams, where the pressure hull had flexed beyond its design limits. Amberger ordered the U-boat to go lower, away from the reach of the depth charges. It was a desperate gamble. U-58's test depth was 164 feet, and the submarine was already wounded. The depth gauge spun past 150 feet, 180, 200, still diving. The jammed stern planes kept driving them deeper. The hulls groaned with sounds no submariner wanted to hear. The protests of steel pushed beyond endurance. At 250 feet, rivets began to fail. Jets of freezing seawater shot across compartments with fire hose pressure. Amberger shouted, quote, "Blow all tanks. Surface. Surface." 500 yards away, Commander Berrien, aboard Nicholson, had witnessed Fanning's attack. Without waiting for orders or explanations, he spun his destroyer toward the rolling water where the depth charge had exploded, intending to drop her own load. As Nicholson completed her turn, the sea erupted. U-58's conning tower burst through the surface like a breaching whale, water streaming from her damaged hull. The submarine wallowed, unable to dive, unable to run. Nicholson's depth charge splashed into the water, almost touching the submarine's hull. The explosion was catastrophic, lifting U-58's bow completely clear of the water before it crashed back down. Inside the submarine, men were thrown against bulkheads, lights shattered, and the few remaining electrical systems died. The destroyer's crews, not believing their eyes, not believing they truly had a U-boat at their mercy, froze for several seconds before opening fire. Then, both destroyers opened up simultaneously. 3-inch shells from Fanning's stern gun, 4-inch rounds from Nicholson's bow mount. Waterspouts erupted around the submarine as gunners found their range. 3 salvos from each destroyer. Then there was movement on U-58's deck. Hatches clanging open, men pouring out, hands raised high. Some waved white clothes, anything that might be seen as surrender. The guns fell silent. The battle had lasted exactly 15 minutes. Fanning approached cautiously, guns still trained on the submarine. Carpenter ordered lines prepared to take the submarine in tow, but as his destroyer drew alongside, he could see water already washing over U-58's deck. The Germans were scuttling their boat. Amberger had given his final order as commander: open the seacocks, flood the ballast tanks, and deny the enemy their prize. His crew executed with the same efficiency they had shown in combat. U-58 began settling rapidly, her deck awash, men scrambling to abandon ship before she took them down. They leapt into the North Atlantic, gasping as the freezing water hit them. November in these latitudes meant water temperatures that could take a life in minutes. Some submariners became entangled in the radio antenna, dragged under as the submarine settled. Fanning's crew threw lines to the struggling Germans, but hands numbed by cold water couldn't grip the ropes. Men who had survived depth charges and shell fire now faced drowning mere yards from salvation. Chief Pharmacist Mate Eleazar Harwell looked at the struggling men, then at Coxswain Francis G. Connor. No words were needed. Both men stripped off their jackets and dove into the icy Atlantic. The shock of the cold water was like being punched in the chest. They swam to the nearest Germans, securing lines around them so shipmates could haul them aboard. One by one, 38 Germans were pulled from the water. Fanning's crew wrapped them in blankets, gave them hot coffee, and treated their injuries. 2 were beyond help. Chief Engineer Franz Glinder, exhausted from his efforts to save his submarine, had slipped beneath the surface before rescuers could reach him. Another sailor, pulled aboard alive, had a heart attack on Fanning's deck, his body unable to cope with the shock. U-58 made her final dive slowly, almost gracefully. Her bow rose as the stern flooded, propellers breaking the surface one last time before she slid backward into the depths. The journey back to Queenstown was subdued. German prisoners huddled in Fanning's mess decks, some still shaking from cold and shock. American sailors brought them dry clothes and cigarettes. When Fanning's whaleboat came alongside the dock at Queenstown, something extraordinary happened. As the German prisoners prepared to disembark, they suddenly broke into applause. 38 voices raised in 3 cheers for their captors, a spontaneous gesture that caught everyone by surprise. Amberger, maintaining his dignity despite defeat, formally thanked Carpenter for the treatment his men had received, calling it, quote, much better than expected. 2 days later, Carpenter took Fanning back to sea with a somber duty. Chief Engineer Franz Glinder's body, sewn in canvas with a weight at his feet, lay on a plank beneath the German naval ensign. The crew assembled on deck. Carpenter read the burial service as former enemies stood at attention. The plank tilted, and Glinder slid into the sea he'd sailed beneath, buried with the same honors afforded any sailor. Vice Admiral Sir Louis Bailey himself came aboard when Fanning returned, bringing congratulatory messages from the British Admiralty. Captain Joel Pringle, Chief of Staff for U.S. destroyers in European waters, read similar cables from Admiral William Benson and Vice Admiral Sims. Awards would follow. The Navy Cross for Lieutenant Henry and Coxswain Loomis, whose extraordinary eyes had saved the convoy. Distinguished Service Medals for Commander Berrien and Lieutenant Carpenter. But the greatest honor was simpler: permission to paint a star on Fanning's funnel, marking the first confirmed U-boat sinking by a U.S. Navy destroyer. U-58 represented more than a single victory. It became a tactical blueprint that validated the Allies' new aggressive approach to the war at sea. The after-action reports from Fanning and Nicholson were distributed across the fleet, transforming anti-submarine doctrine almost overnight. Lookouts were retrained to spot the faintest signs of a periscope, not just torpedo wakes. Depth charge drills became systematic and relentless. The engagement proved that destroyers could be more than passive shepherds. They could be hunters, turning the U-boat's hunting grounds into a trap. This new offensive mindset, when scaled across the entire Atlantic convoy system, yielded staggering results. Of the nearly 9,000 ships that sailed in escorted convoys by the end of 1917, only 27 were lost, a loss rate of less than 0.3%, compared to over 7% for ships sailing independently. The Allies had found the antidote to Germany's invisible hunters. For the German Imperial Navy, the consequences were devastating. The hunter had become the hunted. U-boat losses mounted, with 61 submarines lost in 1917 and even more in 1918, an unsustainable rate of attrition for their elite crews. Reports from captured sailors and naval intelligence spoke of rising dread and flagging morale within the U-boat flotillas. A strategy designed to starve Britain was instead bleeding Germany's submarine force dry. In a twist of irony, the failure of these lone wolf attacks forced German commanders to experiment with group tactics, planting the seeds of the wolf pack strategy that would re-emerge 2 decades later.